when they realize that something is wrong and they want to work together. So no one will ever probably realize all that both of them did to put this together, but I think it shows, the power. If two people can do this, then what can, a larger movement accomplish? So next up, I'm going to have Leo come up here and tell you the story. His son was injured fighting for the YPG, or the YPG in Rojava, and he's going to come up and then introduce Matt, who was a fighter with the YPG in Rojava, who was wounded by ISIS. So here's Leo.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, enjoy this lovely weather because it's great, and I'm very happy to be here in the name of my son because he should be here, but he's not here. Thank you. So let me start with the beginning. It was about half a year ago that I was working with Nessie in the setup of helping with how do you call that? The Red Cross, but then we took the Kurdish Red Crescent with its representative, and we started working together on that. My son got interested. He said, "What are you doing there?" And I said, "Well, look at it. This is nice. You might like it." So on, and he saw the picture of his big favorite in the beginning, anyway, of Jordan. And he said, "That's what I like to do." So I said, "Okay, go ahead if you like it, check it out." And then a week later, believe it or not, he said, "Dad, I'm going." That I didn't want to do. So he left. Sold everything, and he just took off. He went there with his knowledge. He's a trained soldier from way long. He's a combat man, he's a good sniper. So he's in the right position over there. And he enjoyed being there. Then he was start training the YPG, the women, the female part, in their training because that needed extra attention, and that was important because too many young lives were lost due to lack of education and martial ways and fighting ways. Now he wanted to change that. Unlucky for him, he was sent to that area where they were fighting, and he got injured heavily. He got a fragment in his head, in his body. His left side is paralyzed. I can tell you right now, 2 weeks ago, he showed me actually that I can walk. Thanks, Lord. So that was, I think, something special because nobody expected it. Well, those who believe know what happened. I think this is a good thing for us to remember that we have people coming from all abroad, all over the world to assist in this terrible fight. And I don't know how I can say, but I admire all those people. And I want to introduce you to another son I have. Come up here, please. I call him son because he was fighting with my son together. He was the same time, the same area, so he knew all about it. It would be nice if he could tell something about that because he was there too. I was there in that area to pick him up because our government didn't want to help. And I decided to pick him up myself. And I did. So that's why my son is in Germany, safe and sound. Now I have to look after this son. So, Matthew, go ahead. It's all yours, man. Thank you very much.
My name is Matthew Kowalski. I'm from Fort Myers, Florida. I'm also known as Dijwar Shoresh. I joined the YPG back in December. I was tired of seeing U.S. Take a deep breath. I was shot and wounded in Shangal back in February. I had the honor of serving with both Shahid Bogok, Ashley Kent Johnston, and Shahid Kamal, Constantinos Eric Skirfield. Whenever I was shot and wounded, it was a HPG PKK military soldier that carried me maybe 400 meters down to where the rest of my squad was. Costa, another American, and this HPG soldier saved my life. It's time to delist the PKK. They're not terrorists. These men are leading the fight against ISIS. The PKK at its very core is a human rights movement, and they deserve our support. And that's really all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, God.
I'm going to speak a little bit about Matthew because I know, knowing his story and knowing him and how humble he is, he's not really going to come up here and tell you about a lot of the things that he accomplished and that he did with the, the YPG, with the YPG. He's officially the first American wounded fighting ISIS, actually, at this point, because, he can't bend his own leg. He's not sure if he's ever going to run again or walk again. And he did this fighting ISIS, but he did this fighting alongside the YPG or the YPG. We use the Kurdish pronunciation, but the YPG and the PKK are fighting against ISIS. And the United States still considers one of them a terrorist and not the other, when they are essentially the same group under the same philosophy, fighting the same group, fighting real terrorists. On behalf of the United States, on behalf of humanity, on behalf of Western civilization, everything you could think of, and yet they are branded the same and put in the same boat as the actual terrorists in ISIS. So, but as for the position of Matthew, 2 of the 4 guys in his unit were martyred. One was from Australia and one was from England. And so it's showing the global fight even. People are coming to fight with the Kurds amongst all the nations. Greeks, Australians, British, Americans, Canadians, are joining up and joining the YPG, the PKK as well. And it's time for the Western countries to acknowledge this and to understand that they're on the front lines fighting ISIS. And if the United States isn't going to fight them personally, they could at least provide guns and weapons to those that are fighting them. Because for far too long, the United States have given resources to nations that don't really like the United States very much. And here you have probably the most pro-US group in the entire Middle East, the Kurdish people, and it's a shame. I mean, it's really a tragedy in the way that U.S. policy has been treating them up to this point. But hopefully that's about to change, and this rally is a small step in getting that awareness out there. And but yeah, thank you, Matthew, and for everything you did. Next up, I'm going to have Perry with the Kurdish Human Rights Organization. Is going to. I didn't know if she's. Are you ready?
Well, thank you. Hello, Rosh Bash. Let's all say Rosh Bash in Kurdish.
Rosh Bash.
Hey, you did it. Thank you. Thank you for being here in our nation's capital. We are Kurdish Americans, and we appreciate all the efforts that our American friends fought with us with our Peshmerga. I'm a daughter of Peshmerga. My father was a Peshmerga. My grandfather was a Peshmerga. And I can tell you that arming the Peshmerga is very important. Without arming the Peshmerga, they cannot fight evil. And ISIS is evil. It's a threat for all of us, for America, for Middle East, for Kurds, for everyone. And it is something that we all need to work on. We all need to get excited. We all need to support our brave Peshmerga. It doesn't matter where they are, who they are. They're Kurds. They're friends of America. They love America. They love the freedom that the United States stands for. And we believe in human rights. We believe in freedom for all. We believe in human rights for all. And Kurds love America. So I want you to join us in this rally and beyond in supporting Kurds and Kurdistan and paving the way for a friendship that's going to last for a long, long time. We love you. We appreciate what you do. We want you to write to your congressional members, to your senators and congressmen. There is a bill in the House to arm the Peshmerga. And all of our Peshmerga, whether they are YPG, whether they are in southern Kurdistan in Iraq, whether they are in, Kurds are persecuted in 4 parts of the world, the only nation in the Middle East without a country, and it is time to give them the right to have their own country. And I know you Americans, you love freedom, you love what is just and right, and you will not stand for injustice. And that's why I love America, and that's why I love you. And I want you to support our cause and to write to your people in Congress and tell them, support an independent Kurdistan, support freedom in Turkey for the Kurds, support freedom for Kurds in Iran, support freedom for the Kurds in Iraq, and support the Kurds in Syria. Let's all say together, Bishi Kurdistan, Bishi Peshmerga. Thank you. Love you. God bless you.
All right, now this is the point where normally an MC would introduce me, but since I'm doing the MCing, I'll introduce myself. My name is Thoreau Red Crow, but my Kurdish name is Soro, which means red. My story and my interest in the Kurds began in 1988. My father was in the U.S. Air Force, and he was stationed in Adana, near the border of northern Kurdistan, or what is called Bakur, which is north in Kurdish. And in 1988 was when Saddam Hussein gassed the southern Kurdistan town of Halabja. And I remember hearing about this as a 6-year-old and wondering, what was going on, because it was just right across the border from where I was. And then, 1990 and 1991 happened in the first Gulf War, and the United States told the Kurds to rise up against Saddam and that they would back them if they did. And unfortunately, it's one of the tragedies in U.S. foreign policy that when the Kurdish people did rise up against Saddam, the United States was no longer there and basically let them hang out to dry, and they were massacred at that point. And so I remember also, at this time living in northern Kurdistan in Bakur, or what the rest of the world might call Turkey. I remember, having young Kurdish friends, and a lot of their older brothers were suddenly disappearing in 1990 and 1991. And what was happening was Turkey was basically taking them up into the mountains and executing them. There's tens of thousands of Kurdish fighters and different Kurds that have lived in Turkey that have been disappeared and killed by the Turkish government, and that government has never had to pay a price for that action. One of the great ironies when the United States went into Iraq the second time in 2003 was they used the justification of Saddam gassing the Kurds as why we needed to go into Iraq. They said, well, Saddam has oppressed and gassed the Kurds. Well, one of the great ironies of that is in the 1980s, Saddam had a campaign called the Al-Anfal campaign, and basically what he wanted to do was eliminate the Kurds in northern Iraq, and Saddam began killing them in very large numbers, over 100,000, destroyed about 2,000 villages. And when you see someone from southern Kurdistan who was there during the 1980s, they can tell you about this, great trauma that affected them and everyone in their family. And a lot of the Kurdish diaspora and people here in the United States, they came either during that time or right after. And so one of the great ironies of that, though, is right across the border in Turkey, in northern Kurdistan, in the 1990s, Turkey carried out a systematic campaign killing over 200,000 Kurds, destroying 3,500 villages, and actually surpassed all of the brutality of Saddam during the 1990s. However, because they were doing this with U.S. weaponry and Apache helicopters, and they were good clients of, you know, U.S. foreign policy and a NATO ally, they were basically let off the hook.
Wow.
And, you know, Winston Churchill had a quote that America will usually do what's right after they've exhausted all other options. Well, at this point, you know, one of the things we're trying to get to do, you know, the United States government to do, is to right this wrong. And that for far too long, the United States has been silent while all four nations, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey, have brutalized their Kurdish populations. You have a group of about 40 million people that don't have a state of their own, and that in each and individual ways have had their languages banned, their holidays banned, their culture banned. They haven't been able to name their children Kurdish names. At one point, the Turkish government was so paranoid, they began renaming everything that had a Kurdish name. So the Kurdish fox became the Turkish fox. And Kurds themselves became mountain Turks. They basically denied the identity that even Kurds existed. And so for any Kurd, obviously, none of this is news to them. But our hope with this project is to let the American people know this full story, because when the American people know the full story, they are pro-Kurdish. Because if the United States government got together and wanted to design a people and a culture that they could be allied with in the Middle East, it would be the Kurds. You know, the Kurdish culture and Kurdish people advocate for gender equality. They're advocating for ecological responsibility, for social responsibility economically. The recently, you know, Kurdish groups and, you know, democratic and federalist groups have advocated for, you know, gay rights, transgender rights, a whole bunch of different, you know, issues that no one else in the Middle East will even touch. No groups will even touch these issues at all. And it's the, you know, leading voice of, usually the Kurdish guerrillas are the ones leading this voice oftentimes. And it's about time that the Western world stopped looking at them as terrorists and acknowledge that they are, you know, the best hope for the entire region.
That's right.
If you look at our 10 points that we have listed here, I just wanted to briefly cover them in case maybe someone was unsure of the context or why we have these 10 points. What do they mean? So number one, we're calling on the United States government to arm the YPG and the YPJ in Rojava, or Western Kurdistan, to defeat ISIS. Basically, these are the two main groups that are on the front lines battling ISIS. And I would say the entire, you know, American people, Europe, the entire Western world, everyone who disagrees with ISIS owes a debt of gratitude to the YPG and the YPJ for fighting in Rojava and the resistance that they put up. There was a city called Kobani that people in the, you know, U.S. may have heard of in the media in passing. It was a city that I was able to, you know, visit and be on the outskirts of last year in October. And I basically, for an entire week, I watched ISIS tanks rolling into Kobani and firing mortars into Kobani, and YPG and YPJ soldiers were holding this hill, and the ISIS fighters were trying to capture it. And during this battle, I'm laying, you know, at night I would lay there and I would feel the U.S. airstrikes as the U.S. airstrikes were happening. Occasionally the U.S. would blow up one of the ISIS tanks. But the great tragedy of this situation is right along the border you had hundreds, well, usually dozens of Turkish tanks lined right up along the border, doing nothing against ISIS. So here you have a government that is supposed to be a NATO ally standing there doing nothing, with literally their tanks pointing at the ISIS tanks as they are killing Kurds. Well, if you know the situation behind that, you know why you know why that occurred. And the reason that occurred is because Turkey, the great untold thing in the Western media right now is Turkey has been using ISIS as a proxy army against the Kurds. In the same way, Turkey could maybe make the argument that the U.S. has done this themselves historically. And like I said, I'm not here to defend or apologize for the mistakes that the U.S. has made in the past. They've armed the Contras in Nicaragua. They've armed the Mujahideen and Osama bin Laden, and, you know, to fight the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. But unfortunately, in this situation, Turkey has made the wrong calculation. They decided to use ISIS as a proxy army to attack the Kurds in Rojava and in southern Kurdistan, basically, or what the rest of the world might call northern Syria and northern Iraq. And this is pretty much common knowledge to almost every single Kurd that lives in the region. And when I was I had the opportunity to be in all 3 regions of Kurdistan last year, in the north, in the west, and in the south. Pretty much every city in Kurdistan I visited over a 5-month period. And the constant frustration and disappointment that you could hear in Kurds' voices when they would say, why isn't America supporting us? Why isn't America pro-Kurdish? We actually like the United States. There is an airport called the George Bush Airport that you can fly into. Everywhere else in the Middle East, shoes were being thrown at them, but in Kurdistan they named an airport after them. However, this is, no good deed goes unpunished, and apparently all of their loyalty to American principles and to the American government have gone unrewarded. Another great tragedy that took place, and what we're calling on the United States government to do, is basically to arm the KRG Peshmerga in northern Iraq, or Iraqi Kurdistan, what Kurds would call Bashur, in the south. You have Peshmerga fighters there that have been fighting ISIS as well, just in the same way that the YPG have been fighting them in Syria, or Rojava. And but the mistake that the United States government is doing is they're sending the weapons that these Kurds in Iraq are supposed to use to Baghdad first. But when you send the weapons to Baghdad first, which pretty much everyone knows at this point is controlled by Tehran and Iran, the weapons never make it to the Kurds. So one of the things we're asking the United States government to do is to send the arms directly to the KRG Peshmerga in Hawler or Erbil to an American audience. One of the difficult things about, as you're probably noticing as I'm speaking about this situation, is a lot of the places have multiple names. You have a Kurdish name, an American name, what it's called commonly, so that's why I have to keep going over the different names. But I wanted to grab this card down here, but can you grab that for me, Jerry? Great. I print 2,000 of these, and then when I want one. So the next thing we're asking for, and this is one of the important things for me at this point, because last year I was fortunate enough to be given access to the PKK fighters. And after spending time with the PKK fighters, I probably interviewed them for 100 hours. A lot of the top leadership of the PKK. And there were nights when I was done meeting with the PKK where I would literally feel sick to my stomach. I would feel almost like I was about to vomit. And the reason is because the reality of what the U.S. had painted them as was so different and so disgustingly opposite. There goes my card again, Murphy's Law. But it was so disgustingly opposite from the reality of the situation that I almost couldn't look them in the face anymore and answer for why they were being treated the way they were. There was a story once when I'm laying there with the PKK and we're getting ready to go to sleep, and then, for context, I was doing my doctoral dissertation on the PKK and the Kurdish fighters, and that's why I was in the region there. And there was one night where, earlier in the day, we had watched a video where ISIS had beheaded, several people on video, basically just cut their heads off. And the United States considers them terrorists, rightly. However, later that night, when I'm sitting with the PKK, a spider crawled on my shoulder. And I kind of flicked my arm, because I don't like spiders. And the spider fell on the ground, and my natural reaction would be to kill the spider. But the PKK fighters saw me doing this and said, no, Soro. And they ran up and picked up the spider and gently carried it outside and put it in the grass. And so you had this really weird dichotomy. I'm sitting here with the so-called terrorists who won't step on a spider and who are killing ISIS, but yet the United States has them on a terrorist list. And you start to realize how up is down and everything is upside down. And you realize that it's politics that are driving U.S. policy, not the real reality and not the true situation. So one of the things we're calling on the United States government to do is to remove PKK from the terrorist list. The United States has removed many groups who you could make the case should be on the list still, but there is no case to be made that the PKK should still be on the terrorist list. We also would like the United States government to move PJAK from the terrorist list. They are basically the Peshmerga or the guerrilla fighters in Iran. The United States says that they don't support the Iranian government, but yet they don't support the Kurdish fighters that are fighting the Iranian government. And so you start to realize how so much of the situation doesn't make any sense. But it should be pointed out that since 1984, the PKK or PJAK or any of these groups that are considered terrorists haven't killed a single American citizen, a single European citizen. And I think that's an important distinction to make. If you're going to label someone a terrorist, you should be able to show that they've actually harmed your country in some way, not just they're a terrorist because we disagree with them. Also, during my research, I was able to interview hundreds of Kurds who had been, basically tortured on a daily basis in Turkish prisons. I myself was brought in by the Turkish government and interrogated for about 8 hours. And the quote that the Turkish officers told me was, normally we would torture you, but you're an American, so we don't want an international incident. And so if you want any kind of context of just who we're dealing with here, you have to consider that then after that, the Turkish government decided in their infinite wisdom to charge me for 5 years in prison for speaking out against ISIS. I guess my trial is, coming up next month. Of course, Turkey will have a trial for me not there. They'll have a trial and a show trial and probably convict me to 5 years. I don't really care at this point because I'm going to continue speaking the truth whether they sentence me to prison or not. So one of the things we're calling on is for the Turkish government to release at least 14,000 Kurdish political prisoners. The exact numbers isn't even known at this point, but they're in the thousands. So many Kurdish mothers who never know what happened to their sons. They have no idea. In the same way, if you go to Iraqi Kurdistan or southern Kurdistan, you can see the museums of Saddam's torture. You can see the Halabja memorial of the people gassed by Saddam. One day there will be memorials and museums of the Turkish brutality against Kurds as well. It's just not there yet. And when that occurs, the United States itself at this point is going to be implicated if they don't correct this policy. They've done a lot of bad things in this situation, but the United States can at least make it right now by realizing the error of their policy. In that light, we're also calling, we know it would never happen, but these objectives are based on what should be done, not what will be done. But we would call for Turkey to be removed from NATO. I don't see how necessarily NATO can be taking on ISIS if Turkey is using them as a proxy army. We'd also like to denounce Iran for their continual hanging of Kurdish activists. Pretty much every Kurd that's on the internet can tell you that on a weekly basis now, you see various images of the government in Tehran hanging Kurdish activists. They literally hang them out in the open. They'll use a crane, throw a rope over it, and just hang 3, 5, 8 of them, and just leave them hanging there for everyone to see. This is the Iranian government that some people think the United States should be negotiating with. And I would ask you, do we want to be on the side of the people who hang people openly, or do we want to be on the side of the Kurds who are hanging no one? So basically as a movement, what we would like is for the United States to state that the 40 million Kurds in the Middle East deserve a country of their own. It should come out of Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. It should come out of all 4 regions. They deserve a state of their own. And in the same way that all people deserve a homeland where they can feel free, we should stop denouncing the Kurds as terrorists when their main crime is defending themselves from extermination. If we're going to announce that a group doesn't have the right to defend themselves from extermination, then what do they have a right to do? Lastly, I think it's important to point out one thing, since I do see some media here that maybe they should cover, or a story that should be looked into. I was able to visit 6 Yazidi, which is a religion in southern Kurdistan, the Yazidis. It's basically a religious movement that ISIS tried to wipe out because they view them as devil worshippers, and they view them as all of these other things. And so ISIS tried to kill them all. At one point, you had about 200,000 Yazidis trapped on Mount Sinjar, which is a mountain there in northern Iraq or southern Kurdistan. And I spoke to hundreds of Yazidis, and they told me we wouldn't be alive today if it wasn't for these PKK guerrillas that showed up right as ISIS was about to kill us. You had about 15 PKK guerrillas show up. 6 of them were women, which should be pointed out. At least a third of all Kurdish guerrillas are women. At a time when the United States doesn't trust females to fight in combat, the Kurds do trust their females to fight in combat, and they know that they are perfectly capable of killing ISIS in the same way that a man can. Your anatomy doesn't affect your ability to pull a trigger, as most of you may know. And at this time, these 15 PKK guerrillas basically held off 300 to 400 ISIS for an entire day, and they opened up a corridor, and because of that, these 200,000 Yazidis were able to flee to safety. And so it's one of the great tragedies that you have a group of people who have literally saved hundreds of thousands of lives last year, and they're still on the terrorist list as a reward for it. So I would ask, if the media looks into this, they will see that there's plenty of proof that this occurred, that basically the PKK on Mount Sinjar showed up and held off ISIS long enough for the Yazidi people to be saved. And I think that's important. And lastly, for those of you that are familiar with the struggle of Nelson Mandela in South Africa, during the apartheid regime, the South African government feared Nelson Mandela so much that they put him out on an island. And they figured, well, if we put him out on an island, then his supporters can't rescue him. It's the exact same situation with Turkey and Abdullah Öcalan, whose picture is up here. They have him on an island called Imrali Island, and out in the middle of the sea. And basically, it's our position that Abdullah Öcalan, or the Kurds might call him Sarok Apo, the leader, should not only be released by Turkey, but if there's ever going to be peace within Turkey, it needs to come from an agreement between the Turkish government and Abdullah Öcalan. So hopefully, Turkey will realize, in the same way that the ANC in South Africa, once Nelson Mandela was released, his movement were no longer terrorists. But if you look back at the history, the ANC were considered terrorists by the British, by the United States, by lots of different groups. He was locked up on an island, put away. There was an apartheid regime which held down his people. They put them into Bantu stands in small little areas in South Africa where they had no rights. It's the exact same situation throughout much of Kurdistan. The PKK are fighting. Small areas where they're oppressed. Their leader is put out on an island. And in the same way that Nelson Mandela went from terrorist to freedom fighter, it's my belief, and Turkey will probably add 5 years to my sentence for it, it's my belief that Abdullah Öcalan is the same, and that eventually he should be released, and if peace is ever going to exist in the region, it will come from him. And I guess lastly, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up, but Matthew, who fought with the YPG, would like to say one more thing, I guess. He was up here and, now I have to help him up because ISIS shot him in the leg.
Sorry about this, and I hope I do not offend any Barzani supporters, Peshmerga supporters. I'd like to address the situation in Shangal. Peshmerga abandoned Shangal. It was the PKK that went back and opened the corridor. You won't hear about any HPG or YPG fighters in Shangal. I'd like to address the coalition airstrikes. In my opinion, it's a hollow gesture. The road leading into Shangal, we watched trucks drive in and out of the city all day, completely unhindered. The coalition airstrikes that I did see were completely ineffective. It's time to arm the Kurds, not the Iraqi army. You may as well hand the weaponry right to ISIS. That's really it. Thank you.